That's right, I said it. Artifacts and enchantments are literally exactly the same.
Corporate needs you to find the differences between this picture and this picture.
Okay, I already see one. Give him. Okay.
They're the same picture.
Yeah, I know I've already used that meme before, but guess what? That's not the point. The point is that the only difference between artifacts and enchantments is that artifacts are called artifacts and enchantments are called enchantments, so you can't use something like a Vandal Blast to destroy an enchantment. Other than that, they're the same. I know that this hot take might be just a little too spicy for a regular video, so this will be the very first episode in a new series, Spicy Tofu. Each episode in this series will pretty much just be me ranting about a random spicy hot take. Now back to the point. Artifacts and enchantments are the same. You probably think I'm crazy because deep down in your heart, you know that artifacts and enchantments are different. I mean, they look different, they feel different, and they function differently, right? Well, let's start by going to the rules. If we look at the comprehensive rules of Magic and we scroll down to the sections on artifacts and enchantments, then the rules sound pretty much identical. In fact, the first 3 rules in each section are word for word exactly the same. The only difference is one of them says artifact and the other says enchantment. Those 3 rules basically say this. 1. You can only play artifacts and enchantments at sorcery speed. 2. When an artifact or enchantment spell resolves, it stays on the battlefield. And 3. Artifacts and enchantments have subtypes sometimes. After that, the artifact section starts talking about equipment and vehicles, while the enchantment section talks about auras and sagas. Also, the artifact section does have one extra rule that just says being colorless and being an artifact aren't the same thing, but that rule is pretty much unnecessary. So far, it sounds like these 2 permanent types are exactly the same. They're both just sorcery speed cards that become permanents that stay on the board after you play them. Whoa, hold on. They might not have different functions in the rules, but they have to be different. I mean, for starters, artifacts are colorless and enchantments aren't. This actually isn't true, but it was true for about the first 13 years of the game. There wasn't a single colored artifact in Alpha or Beta or Unlimited, Arabian Nights, Antiquities, Revised Legends, The Dark Fallen Empires, 4th Edition, Ice Age Chronicles, Renaissance, Homelands, Alliances, Mirage Visions, 5th Edition, Portal, Weatherlight, Tempest, Stronghold, Exodus, Portal, 2nd Age, Unglued, Urza Saga, Anthologies, Urza Legacy, 6th Edition, Portal, 3 Kingdoms, Urza Destiny, Star 1999, Mercurian, Mass Battle Royale, Nemesis, Star 2000, Prophecy, Invasion, Beatdown, Planeshift, 7th Edition, Apocalypse, Odyssey, Torment, Judgment, Onslaught, Legion, Scourge, 8th Edition, Mirrodin, Darksteel, 5th Dawn, Champions of Kamigawa, Betrayers of Kamigawa, Saviors of Kamigawa, 9th Edition, Salva, 2005, Ravnica, City of Guilds, or Guild Pact.
I like your funny words, Magic Man!
But then, everything changed when Dissension came out and printed the card Transguild Courier. This card looks colorless because it has a colorless cost, but it's technically a colored artifact because it just is. In fact, Transguild Courier is such a weird card that it caused some rules kerfuffles in Commander over the idea of color identity. Way back when, color identity wasn't even a thing. The rule was just you can only put cards that match your commander's colors into your deck, and if you make mana outside of those colors, it becomes colorless. This rule was later changed because it completely invalidated some commanders like Memnarch. If you were playing Memnarch as your commander, then your deck would be considered colorless because Memnarch is technically a colorless creature. So you couldn't put any blue cards in your deck, and if you tried to make blue mana, it would just turn colorless instead. Anyways, Transguild Courier was a little weird because I guess it technically used to be a colorless creature that just had an ability that made it every color? Which I guess used to be different? I read through some old articles but couldn't figure out exactly how it worked. All I know is they oracled it to not have the ability and instead just have an implied 5-color symbol on it, but then they changed it back because they realized that was dumb. Luckily, Wizards eventually figured out how to make colors work. Anyways, long story short, Transguild Courier was the first colored artifact. It wasn't until a year later with Sarcomite Myrrh that we got an artifact that actually required you to spend colored mana to cast it. Since then, we've gotten close to 300 colored artifacts. The vast majority are in the Esper colors, but in recent years we've been getting colored artifacts across all the colors pretty often. So no, not all artifacts are colorless. And on the flip side, not all enchantments have a color. There are actually colorless enchantments, but it wasn't until 2010 that we got the first one. Eldrazi Conscription is a huge tribal enchantment, Eldrazi Aura. I guess it makes sense that the first colorless enchantment is also an Eldrazi because being colorless is kind of what they do. Even the ones that have a color almost always are colorless because they have the Devoid mechanic. In fact, that's what was responsible for the next 3 colorless enchantments, From Beyond, Molten Nursery, and Visions of Brutality. These are like the opposite of Transguild Courier. They look like they have a color, but they're technically colorless because they just are. And we even got another colorless enchantment that's become a staple in nearly every format it's legal in. Urza's Saga was our very first enchantment land, and just like every other land, it's also colorless.
I'm standing right here, Bob.
So not all artifacts are colorless, and not all enchantments have a color. It just so happens that most artifacts are colorless, and most enchantments aren't. But that isn't a real distinction, because it doesn't hold for every artifact and enchantment. But artifacts have activated abilities, and enchantments don't. This was actually never true. Even in the very first set of Magic, there were artifacts without activated abilities, and there were enchantments with activated abilities. So let's take a quick trip back to 1993, the year it all began. People were playing for Ante, Sarah Angel was busted, and you didn't have to sell your car to afford a Black Lotus. Back in those days, artifacts were weird. They came in 4 different types: mono, poly, continuous, and creature. Mono artifacts could only be used once a turn and then you would tap them, while poly artifacts could be used as many times as you want. Continuous artifacts were just artifacts that had static effects, and artifact creatures were just artifacts that were also creatures. The way artifacts used to work was they were on when they were untapped and they were off when they were tapped. This applied to all artifacts, even the ones without activated abilities. So if you had an Ankh of Mishra out but it was tapped, it just didn't do anything. You treated it like it had no text. Funnily enough, this also led to a lot of contradictions in the early days of Magic. For example, take the card Mana Vault. This artifact says it doesn't untap normally during your untap step. But when an artifact is tapped, you're supposed to treat it like it doesn't have any text. So a tapped Mana Vault should be able to untap like normal. Rules like this were an absolute mess, and at some points, it even seemed like the card designers would forget about the on-off rule for artifacts when designing them. So the rule basically became, artifacts have abilities when they're untapped, and they don't have abilities when they're tapped, unless that doesn't really make sense for the card, and then just figure out what you think it should do. Luckily, the original rules included some very helpful advice. It literally says toward the end, during the course of a game, a dispute that you cannot resolve by referencing the rules may occur. If both players agree, you can resolve the difference for the current game with a coin toss. So yeah, before judges existed, you were just supposed to flip a coin, I guess. I had a pretty fun time reading through it, so I'll leave a link in the description in case you want to check it out. So anyways, there have always been artifacts with activated abilities and without. And the original set also had enchantments with activated abilities and enchantments that didn't. So this was also never a distinction. There was a distinction that artifacts didn't work when they were tapped, but since that rule is gone now, there's currently no difference between artifacts and enchantments. My more cynical viewers might be thinking, okay, there might be enchantments with activated abilities, but there aren't any enchantments that can tap, so that makes them different from artifacts. This too is actually false. There are enchantments that can tap. And no, I don't mean enchantment creatures that tap to attack someone, I mean there are normal enchantments that have tap abilities. Flowstone Embrace and Second Wind are auras that can tap to affect the creature that they're on, and Witch's Mist is a normal, honest-to-goodness enchantment that just has a tap ability. If you're a little newer to Magic, you might be wondering why these cards look super weird. So let's dive into another lengthy tangent about Future Sight, the weirdest Magic expansion of all time.
Things are gonna get crazy.
Nowadays, Magic players are always begging for reprints of their favorite expensive cards, but in 2007, WotC decided to flip the script by pre-printing cards instead. They just took a bunch of card ideas that they were planning on making someday and printed them all at once. This means Future Sight featured a ton of new mechanics and keywords. In fact, to this day, the keywords Absorb, Fortify, Frenzy, Grandeur, Gravestorm, Poisonous, Aura Swap, and Transfigure have all only been printed on cards that are originally from Future Sight. And most of these keywords only show up on a single card each. So while it may have only happened in one set that was specifically designed to be super weird, there are enchantments with tap abilities, so being able to tap does not distinguish artifacts from enchantments. Just to be thorough, I should mention that there are 5 more enchantments with tap abilities, but they're all artifact enchantments, so they don't really count. And I guess that brings me to the end of my thesis. While artifacts and enchantments might be generally different when viewed as a whole, there is no functional rules difference between them, and there is no line you can draw between artifacts and enchantments that separates them perfectly. And if anything, recent sets like Eldraine have only brought them closer together. For example, Glass Casket was an artifact from Eldraine, and it is functionally identical to Silk Wrap, except Silk Wrap is an enchantment. So I guess the only question now is this a problem? Is it okay that artifacts and enchantments are kind of the same now? I think it's probably fine, because even though artifacts and enchantments are getting more similar, they still feel different. There will definitely be some overlap, but at the end of the day, as long as the flavor makes sense, I don't think it's much of an issue. Silk Wrap has flavor that makes sense as an enchantment. It looks like some sort of enchanted silk that traps your opponent's small creatures. Glass Casket also has flavor that makes sense. It's just a box that you can trap a small creature in, so it should definitely be an artifact. But what do you think? Is it bad that artifacts and enchantments are becoming more homogenized? Or is it cool that we're getting more options, so we could run cards like Glass Casket in artifact decks and cards like Silk Wrap in enchantment decks? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. It's trivia time. Last week's question was, which color does not have any creatures with a fear ability? And the answer is... mono green. Dust Elemental is the only mono white creature with fear. Scornful Aetherlich is technically a mono blue creature with a fear granting ability, even though it does have a white and black symbol in the text box. Squealing Devil is the only red creature with fear, although it too has a black mana symbol. And Arcbound Fiend and Dross Golem are the only two colorless creatures with fear. I guess green just isn't a spooky color. If you got that one right, go ahead and give yourself 31 Tofu points as a special Halloween bonus. Now for today's question. As we learned, cards from Alpha were pretty weird and confusing. Magic cards have gone through a ton of reformatting to go from these confusing piles of text to the sleek, organized designs that we're used to. But there are exactly 2 cards from the original Alpha set that are formatted exactly the same way as current Magic cards. Can you guess what they are? What 2 cards from Alpha would have exactly the same text if we reprinted them today? One of them is pretty obscure, but the other one is a really famous card that you've probably heard of. Make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss the answer in the next video. Thanks for watching.